100. So this one, which is like the social average, pretty much, there is 80 invested in constant capital and 20 spent on wages, effectively invested in buying labor power. And so this is 80 over 20 is what he calls the organic composition of capital. And he does, in his theorization of this, look at it from that side on. So it's a technical relation which is reflected in a value relation. Now you can have different sectors. Let's take two others as being at the two extremes. In sector 3, the amount invested in labor is twice as much as in sector 1. Okay, so in other words, there's twice as many workers set in motion by the same amount of total capital invested. And the only way that can be is that relatively less has been invested in machinery and raw materials. So there's more workers in sector 3 than there are in sector 1. Okay, but what's called the organic composition of capital is actually lower. The ratio here is 4 to 1. The ratio here is 1.5 to 1. Okay, so this is a labor intensive sector. And then we take a third example, which again is drawn from Marx's, directly from Marx. Okay, and so we have 100 invested altogether, but this is a capital intensive sector. And what we have is much more capital invested in the machinery and raw materials and much less paid out in wages. So here, there's only a quarter of the amount of money paid in wages. And if the wage rate is the same as it is in the other sectors, that means that there's only 1/8 of the workers here than there is here, or 1/4 here compared to here. Okay, so this is the capital intensive sector. Now, what Marx's solution shows is that so long as the rate of surplus value is the same across the sectors, then what that means is that once we equalize the rate of profit, then the simple value in this sector, the low organic composition, highly labor intensive sector, the price of production is lower than the simple value. And in this sector, contrariwise, the high capital intensive, high organic composition capital sector, the price of production is higher and the profits are higher than the surplus value created. Here, the profits are lower than the surplus value created. Okay, so there's a necessary divergence by sector between surplus value and profit. Okay. The total surplus value here, we add all these up, is going to equal the total profit. Okay, but the profit is realized differently, and the profit is realized according to the amount of capital advanced, not according to the amount of labor set in motion. That's the whole point of Marx's example. Now, what I want to do is to rework the example, but instead of thinking of these sectors as equal amounts of capital, I want to set off exactly the same motion, if you like, but from a different starting point with equal amounts of living labor. So what I've done here is just simply said that for every sector, we're going to have 20 variable capital. And again, if the wage rate's the same, this will set in motion equal amounts of living labor. But I'm going to change the capital advanced required to set this living labor in motion. So if you look at this ratio here, it's the same 30 over 20 as we had here, but I'm reducing the number of workers in the sector, so it's the same as the number of workers in sector 1, okay? So it only takes, for a labor-intensive sector, to set a given equal number of workers in motion, it takes less capital to be invested. And contrariwise, if we have a capital intensive sector, then in order to set the same number of workers in motion, a lot more capital has to be invested. And in fact, on the numbers that Marx gives us, 4 times more capital needs to be invested in this capital intensive sector. And if you work through the example, you'll find that in fact, there's more capital invested, advanced in this capital intensive sector than in the whole of the rest of the sectors put together. So that's 400 out of 750. So when it comes to claiming the profit according to and in proportion to the capital invested, then this sector claims more than half the profit. Now, remember again, we've got equal amounts of living labor being set in motion in the different sectors, but they generate different amounts of profit because the capital required to set them in motion is different. So the profit arises not directly out of the amount of labor, but does arise directly out of the amount of capital. Okay. So what I'm saying here is, the other point to make, by the way, is that the overall rate of profit falls, because before it's 22%, now we've got a lot more capital invested in the highly capital intensive sector. This is one of the contradictions of the system, which is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. As the overall organic composition of capital increases, the overall proportion of capital in constant capital is much higher than in variable capital, i.e. There's less living labor set in motion by the amount of capital invested, and therefore there's less surplus value. So overall, the rate of profit is low, and here the rate of profit is down to 13%, as distinct from 22%, which it was before. And look here, every sector, apart from the capital intensive sector, has a price of production which is lower than the simple value of the sector, of the commodities in that sector. So this is, on Marx's numbers, quite an extraordinary result. What we see is a huge concentration in the high organic composition of capital sector. So that was me sort of repositioning Marx's solution without really going much more deeply into it. But now that's exactly what I want to do. What the solution needs to do is to account for socially necessary abstract labor time, but account for it in money terms, which is now costs and profits. So we need to bring back living labor into the transformation. It's not only how surplus value becomes profit, nor even how surplus labor becomes profit, but actually the solution needs to explain how the totality of living labor is expressed in a capitalist system. And what we'll see is that this is very much an extension of Marx's idea of alienation, which is the subjectivity which is provided by living labor becomes an alienated objectivity, completely alien to what it is itself, not only in content, but in form as well. I'll try to make that clear. And of course, once we understand this, there's always a possibility that it can be transformed back again. So what I've got here is a similar example to Marx. I've just simplified it simply for ease of communication. So this is very similar to Marx's setup here, but I've just got two other sectors, one which has got a relatively low organic composition of capital, and one which has got a high organic composition of capital. So the amount of capital invested is still 100 in each sector, total of 300 altogether. The surplus value at the same rate of surplus value is different because more workers are employed in this sector than are employed in this sector. The total surplus value is 60, the total capital invested is 30, therefore the average rate of profit is 60 over 300, sorry I said 30, I should have said 300, is 20%, okay? So if you allocate the profit pro rata to the capital advance in each of these sectors, you get a 20% rate of profit and a profit per sector of 20. Now then, let us suppose that with this 20V, we can buy labour power at the rate of £10 an hour.